right, welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies, jointly appointed in the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at Cornell. And before we start our event today, I just want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Cornell University's campus, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayacahono, the Keough Nation. The Gayacahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayacahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayacahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So I would ordinarily now turn and introduce our speaker, but today actually we have somebody who is much better qualified than our speaker. So I'm going to turn things over to David Courtwright. He is Professor Emeritus of the Practice at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and also a wonderful member of our community here at Cornell.
Thank you. I really wanted and I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce Josefina Echavarría Álvarez, who is the director of the Peace Accords Matrix at Notre Dame, which is one of the largest peace research project that's underway there, and one of the biggest actually at the Keough School of International Affairs. And I actually helped to set up the Peace Accords Matrix back in 2016 and managed it for 4 years. And then when I retired, Josefina came along and has been managing it magnificently and has taken it to new heights. This project is, I think, one of the most interesting in all of peace research in terms of using empirical data to try to develop policy understanding and then recommendations for making this peace agreement real. You know, it was negotiated over years, 300 and some pages, 578 stipulations, and we developed this methodology to measure implementation in each of these provisions and then do an overall categorization of the process of implementation. And we were supported initially by the State Department and by European Union and other agencies. And the project had a knife to its heart earlier this year when all of the programs of the State Department were ended. And suddenly a huge budget gap appeared. And the project has several faculty and staff at the University of Notre Dame and a couple dozen researchers on the ground still in Colombia. So Josefina and her team managed to persuade the university and the Kroc Institute provide more money and has sustained the program. And it's been an amazing achievement. And the Peace Accord Matrix is also now monitoring the Philippines agreement and the Bangsamoro Accord. And just recently has developed an even more, I think it's even bigger project in terms of data, which is a legacy project for the Truth Commission. All of the testimony and all of the documents, video and all of that went through this several years of process is now being archived and made available for students and researchers. And we're trying to integrate it into our classroom teaching and spread it to other scholars around the world. So it's a great honor to introduce my dear colleague and Josefina Echavarría.
Well, I think you've already discussed everything I wanted to talk to you about today. So much. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna try not to make anything kaput here. Let me see if do I need this keyboard? No. Can I put this here? Can I wheels back? So thank you so much. I didn't know you were discussing this downstairs. I was upstairs having a very nice talk with David before I was with Sebastian, but I'm so glad that you discussed the readings. And I was just trying to remember, and I looked at my emails, and I think you read one, the last one about the verification of the Colombian Peace Accord, right? And a little encyclopedia entry and a couple of policy briefings. So thank you so much for all of you for leading this session, and thanks to all of you who have just stayed for so long to talk about this. So I don't know if what I'm going to tell you is what you have been discussing for half an hour, but perhaps if you ask questions or if you want me to move forward a bit faster, I'm open to that. See? So I have prepared a presentation that speaks about these two aspects of the work that we do, monitoring and accompanying. And so I only got like the last 3 minutes of your discussion. But of course, we are part of both things are very important for me personally. As monitors, of course, we look at the evidence that is on the ground. We ask ourselves, how can we make that peace accord a reality, a living reality, so that the peace accord is not just a piece of paper, but is actually contributing to well-being, that people perceive that their life has improved after the peace accord has been signed. And accompanying peace building processes is much larger than monitoring. Monitoring is not just a technical task, but for me, it's really an engagement with the context. It's an ethical commitment to peace. And it's, of course, for me, also a mission commitment from the University of Notre Dame. And so what David so kindly was mentioning at the beginning is the way we have been able to keep the project alive despite all the funding crisis is by convincing the university that to accompany people in the process of peace building is part of our mission, and that what we do as peace researchers is, of course, is an intellectual engagement with the topic, but it is an ethical commitment because it stems, at least for us, from a vocation and from a life choice. So kind of like you can't close this project, right? So, and it's worked so far. So that's what we've been doing. So I want to tell you about these two things. And again, please let me know if this sounds perhaps too familiar, if you've discussed this before and you want me to move forward. I know we have a lunch afterwards, so I hope we have the opportunity to speak more about this. Thank you. Thank you very much. So one of the readings that you had for today, since I know that you already discussed it, I think it's very, very fast, is to how do we understand conceptually peace accords? And I always like anchoring peace accords there because, as you just mentioned, signing a peace accord is the beginning of peace building. And if we're lucky and there are a lot of conditions that are met, it will also be the beginning of reconciliation, but it's never the end. And so I think it's important for us to understand what is the role of peace accords in much larger process of peace building. Because for me, a peace accord is like, it's like a gift. It's a window of opportunity. It's a short period of time where we have people, hopefully, if not completely stopping violence, at least diminishing violence in a way that we can engage with much deeper processes of social change, right? So the time that we spend doing that has to be incredibly valuable, because if we don't do a good enough job, we are going to have a new episode of violence. And so for me, the biggest ambition of accompanying peace accord implementation is how do we contribute with our monitoring and accompaniment work to prevent the next war? That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, how do we engage in these changes, not just on the episode of violence, but at the epicenter of conflictivity, so that we can do the transformations, so that we can engage with the reforms, so that we can prevent that from happening again. So perhaps is an ambition that I have that sounds very small, How do you contribute to much larger process of peace building? But I believe it's worth it. I believe that by monitoring the peace accords, we actually make the process more transparent. We make agencies more accountable. We empower civil society. We are civil society as universities, right? And this is what I wanted to talk to you about, because for me, you perhaps know this also very well. We have enough evidence that shows that the participation of civil society in the negotiations, but also in the implementation, and I will go even further, in the verification of the implementation, it's in the end what helps us shield those accords from just being elite-driven settlements and to really move forward and change people's realities and change power relationships. So this participation has to extend into the implementation. And then in the end, by the end of the presentation, I want us to talk about the case of Colombia. David mentioned that we have 2 field units now, one in Mindanao and one in Colombia. And we wanted to talk today about Colombia, and we can talk about this for as long as you want, as deeply as you want. We can also take a step back and talk in a more comparative perspective. It's really up to you. So if you help me with your questions and your comments, I would know more or less where I'm going. If not, I just talk and I talk a lot. I can teach this. So I normally teach this in one semester. So we can stay here for as long as you want. All right. So this is the cover of the book of When Blood and Bones Cry Out. It was published, I think, in 2010 by Jean Paul and his daughter, Angie, who also was a PhD student with us at Notre Dame. And it's a beautiful book of stories, but where they put forward a very interesting theoretical idea or theoretical framework for peace building. And they say, I think we have our metaphors wrong in peace studies and our conceptual frameworks wrong when we think about peace building as a linear process in which you have some kind of conflict, there is some kind of inequality, racism, discrimination, concentration of power relationships, concentration of land, and so on. Then violence kind of like emerges in order to transform that conflict. That violence has a peak, that is war, right? Systematic, organized violence. Then we have a peace settlement, and then we have peace. Which is like, we don't know any place in the world where that has ever been true, right? So what they do, and what I love about this book, is that it gives you a short introduction, and then it tells you a lot of stories. And based on those stories, the last chapter is a conceptual framework that starts by paying attention to the language that we use when we talk about peace building or peace in general. So what they say, and I agree with this very much, and I think it's important for us when we look at peace accords, is that peace accords perhaps evidently are platforms for change. Peace accords are contracts that are signed, the ones that we look at, between governments and illegal armed organizations. Because of their nature, they focus on institutional transformation. But what can they not provide? They can't regulate relationships between people, interrelational encounters, and personal change. They can't. So there's a contract. So you're talking about reforms, you're talking about new disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, you're talking about transitional justice, but that doesn't mean how I change. How do I change when I meet other people on the street? Whom do I marry? Where do my kids go to school? You know what I mean? So what they can regulate are those reforms. They can stop the violence on the surface. So yes, not the violence that is, it tends to recognize that the episodic violence has much deeper roots in larger patterns of violence. And that's why we speak about stopping the violence and dealing with those reforms that we believe are at the heart of conflictivity that produce the violence on the surface. But they are very limited in the sense that they focus very much. Let me see, does this thing have a thingy? Ooh. They focus very much on the institutional reforms, but they really leave aside me, like, how have I changed since the 1st of December 2016? How do I relate to otherness? How do I relate to myself? The marks of the war in our bodies, not just in our psyche, right? In the way we go to school, in the books we read, in the way we dress, the languages we speak. So all those things, what I want is to use my peace accord implementation timeline to engage with all those changes. But I'm very aware that what a contract does is that it privileges the institutions, right? But it can never, there's not a contract that is going to tell me, and finally there's going to be gender equality in Colombia. Or finally there's not going to be any racial discrimination. No. What I can say is, how do ethnic communities participate in decisions about what happens with their land? So what I try to do, and what I take from Lera and Lera, is when we look at post-accord context around the world, what we see is that the processes of change that are ignited, that are started by the signing of peace accords that end most of the violence, not all of the violence, they tend to face episodes of violence after the signature, and we need to be prepared for that. We can't get frustrated every time there's a violation of a ceasefire, because they always get violated. The question is, can those episodes of violence ever be less? And can we, in the meantime, work on those reforms and on healing our relationships in a way that we're ever more resilient? And I do this because they say that instead of thinking of a line, we should think of oral processes of change that always go deeper, so that the violence never hurts us as much, because we have been reconstructing our relationships at the same time. So we never go back to that initial height of violence that we experienced during the war, but we very often face new episodes of violence. So the question is, how are we in our communities, in our societies, better prepared to ever more be able to also face those episodes of violence, and ever more have better tools, better methods, so that we can transform conflict in a non-violent way? Of course, all this framework only works if we differentiate between violence and conflict, right? Because what we want, we don't want to prevent conflict. What we want to prevent is violence. Conflict, if you take the most classical definitions of incompatibilities, attitudes, and behavior, and this very famous triangle of Galton, the question is not how do we eliminate violence, or how to only create social cohesion, how to create consensus. No, it's how do we live with dissent? How do we live with difference? How do we make sure that there's enough political participation so we can have a democratic state, a democratic political regime where voices can be heard? So the question is never how to move away from conflict, but how to move away from violence. This is from the little book of conflict transformation. It's a very old picture too, that tells us this is what I can regulate, right? The episodes, these are the issues, the topics, the themes. This is the materiality. This is also what I can monitor, right? And I'm hoping that by stopping the violence here, I can work at the level of the epicenter. But I cannot confuse the two of them. But this is why peace accord implementation phases really are such a gift, because they tend to be short, maybe 10 years, 12, 15 years. But it's also an exceptional time in which societies agree on dealing, especially with the legacies of the war, in a way that they would never ordinarily agree to do it. And I'm going to be talking about transitional justice at the end. That's the legacy project that David was discussing before. So perhaps we say, yes, there's going to be amnesty for most of the combatants. And we will judge those that are the most responsible ones, those who committed grave crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes. We cannot forgive them. They will need to be judged. But for the rest, we'll give them amnesty. And in exchange, we want to hear the truth. So perhaps that sounds really crazy if we are not in a transition. Perhaps that is not something that people would normally agree, accept, support, and participate in. But when we are trying to finish a war, when we're trying to transition, we agree and we're much more flexible with a lot of our own ideas of justice, redistribution, political participation, right? So we're not only saying there will be an amnesty, and we're not just going to listen to you, you have to tell the truth, we're going to forgive you, but also perhaps we're going to help you get some seats in Congress so that you can give your ideas the opportunity to be tested in a democratic space. And if you're able to engage in those reforms that you've been claiming for years, then you can do it, but do it in a legal way, do it in a democratic way. So you say, but why are these guys that were organized, illegally armed? Yeah, because that's what we do in a transition. So these are exceptional times where we agree to be much more flexible, when we're very generous with a lot of things that we normally wouldn't be. And we have to make sure, and this is important for us as monitors of implementation, this is what we use to even write our reports. The phase of implementation is very important because we are also able to meet each other. Perhaps groups of people that during the war were separated from one another and were full of ideas about otherness, not just stereotypes, but a lot of fears about perhaps enemies and how different they were from us. And I imagine you've talked enough about the processes of dehumanization that precede big episodes of violence, but also that are so difficult to overcome, to deconstruct after violence. And so what we want to do is that during the process of implementation, we're able to create spaces. This is what an example that I want to share with you about the Colombian Truth Commission, so that people that for many years were in separate groups and were fighting each other, that got the opportunity, very little opportunity, to meet one another at a personal level, start meeting. And Leda says the key seems to be in all these different communities around the world that have moved significantly away from violence and that start rebuilding their relationship. The key seems to be the moment in which you realize that the faith and the destiny of your grandchildren is inextricably linked to the faith and the destiny of the grandchildren of your former enemies. When we understand that we're part of a global community, or if you want, a local community, in which we are part of the same network, if you want, that to harm others is also to harm myself, and that their well-being is also the well-being mine and for my communities. And it's that recognition that we are all linked in some way that we also hope to be able to create that awareness, that consciousness. The very building of relationships for many is the first time that they've ever met a former paramilitary or a former guerrilla or even a victim, right? To say, hey, can we rebuild our relationship? So yes, we're gonna redistribute the land and we're gonna create a tribunal and we're gonna open a truth commission, but that relational change, that interpersonal change needs to happen at the same time. So because the institutional changes tend to be rather superficial and easy to change. You normally can change that also by law afterwards. So we don't want to miss that time. We don't want to miss those. We normally look at 10 years past implementation. And the type of agreements that we look at, and this is perhaps just a very short summary of what you had in this encyclopedia article, because what we have seen is that there are ever more peace accords. Ask Donald Trump. Everybody talks about peace accords nowadays, but what we have seen it since the beginning of the 90s, also because the international system changed, obviously, is that there are ever more peace accords being signed to end the wars, and that these peace accords have been growing. We're very tiny, and they tended to focus a lot on security and military issues, and as time has gone by, they've become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And what David was saying is the Colombian Peace Accord has 300 plus pages, right? The Good Friday Agreement 1998 has 16, right? So what you're saying is because they're saying, yes, we need to stop the war, but for this halt of the war, we need to make sure we're engaging in these reforms. Otherwise, this is extremely fragile. This peace, this negative peace is extremely fragile unless we engage in reforms and actions for positive peace. And so some of the things that we have seen in our research is that those comprehensive peace accords, comprehensive because they try to tackle the incompatibilities of the conflict, because they bring the major conflict parties together. We have seen that very often those peace accords have much better rates of implementation than the partial peace accords. So it is a mistake to leave people out of the negotiation table. It is a mistake to only sign ceasefires without engaging with issues. It is not smart what we're doing around the world. A lot of those accords are signed without even having the intention of being implemented. And that creates ever more frustration. We're signing accords without having the major conflict parties at the table and without civil society participation. What our research shows, but not just at PAM, but peace research in general, is that bringing civil society to the table helps the peace accord have grounds. It empowers civil society also to have ownership of the implementation process. So whenever we go through those crises, because we will always go through crises in the implementation process, you at least have the support of civil society. But very often it is civil society, the one that asks for these major reforms. When you sit conflict parties at the table and you only bring the leaders of the military structures, they're very focused on how are we going to disarm? How many arms do you need? Where are going to be the camps? Are we going to have hospitals at the camp? What is the reintegration process? How long is my subsidy going to be? Am I going to have training opportunities? You bring civil society to the table and say, where and how are we going to do the educational reform that you've been asking for the last 40 years? So their voices also tend to focus very much on these provisions that it's like the real meat of social change, the real toast. We have been asked to participate in all sorts of meetings for peace building. Based on what we have learned, we've participated in the UN Security Council, but we also participate in public forums, in schools in Urabá, Colombia. We also participate with universities in conferences. Because based on this, we follow now the implementation of 42 comprehensive peace accords from year 1, 10 years down the road. We have seen that most of those peace accords have certain categories that they need to deal with. Again, it's not just stopping the war, but it's how do you create positive change? How do you engage with these reforms? You can read that on our website. These 51 provisions include ceasefire, amnesty, power sharing, women's rights, reconciliation, truth commissions, natural resources, language, borders, territory, etc. We're able to compare not just one accord next to the other, but the accords in a longitudinal way. So we compare provisions on decentralization along 42 accords. And we start asking questions. For example, when are the implementation rates of women's rights higher? What is happening when I look at the 42 peace accords? Perhaps not all of them have a women's chapter, but when is that rate working? So why do we care? We care about what can we learn from implementation that can be useful, but not when you're implementing the peace accord, but when you're designing them. Because once you've designed it, once you have signed it, your implementation monitoring can be very good. But if it's a bad design, then it doesn't hold. It doesn't hold the peace. The peace is just very superficial, and they tend to fail. So what we try to do is to learn what are our best lessons learned, or what are the best practices for peacemaking. And why do we do that? We recognize how every conflict is unique, how every context is unique, but the questions that peace builders and peacemakers ask tend to be similar. And you can learn about other places around the world, about the way they have faced difficulties, about the way that they have taken advantage of opportunities, and learn something from you. Say, I want to be inspired by that, right? Or, oh, this is a way in which I have never thought about thinking of, I don't know, post-war reconstruction. How do you bring in the international community in a way that you get better funding for your post-war reconstruction? Let's look at major rates of implementation of post-war reconstruction. So the idea is that comparative research cannot give you an answer about what to do with your problem, what to do with your peace accord, but it can help you expand your imagination and copy things from other places. It can also help you prevent a lot of mistakes. We have technical knowledge. We know how to sequence these accords and provisions. There are certain things that you need to do at the beginning. There are certain things that also create a very good, we call it a cascade effect, a positive cascading effect. There are provisions that are formal. There are other provisions that really bring in programs, and they start moving programs, and perhaps by sequencing and prioritizing certain provisions, you can have a better implementation rate in others. So that's what we do. We look at the peace accords. We say, we got to take advantage of this opportunity. How can we really advise? How can we try to have a contribution as best as possible to move away from war? This is one of our many conclusions based on peace accord implementation. First, comprehensive peace accords need to be fine-tuned and adapted. People don't like the word reviewed. But yeah, they need to be fine-tuned as you engage in the process of implementation. One of the policy briefs that I recommended for your readings today was those 4 factors or 4 dimensions that influence peace accord. And of course, the quality of the accord is an important dimension, but it's not the only dimension. The quality of the actors implementing the accord is important. The regional and international dimension is incredibly important, but also if you want, the marks, the leftovers, the persistence of the armed conflict after the peace accord. So for example, if you sign a peace accord, that is with the major conflict parties, but you still have a lot of illegal armed organizations, it's going to affect your implementation trajectory. It has nothing to do with your accord. It has to do with the political situation. So all these different dimensions affect the implementation of peace accord. And what we can do as third party, of course, is to accompany, to support, to monitor, and to facilitate conflict resolution. So what is one very simple idea? It means that if this happens, I need to create conflict resolution mechanisms in the design of the accord. And to have the ability to foresee, I will have problems during the implementation process. And I need to have mechanisms within the accord, not external to the accord. Because people are so afraid after they sign a peace accord, they never want to change it. But I am aware I'm going to have to fine tune it. So how do I do it? And I create something here that allows me to respond to changes on the ground, to the international system, to new groups, perhaps arming or rearming or dissidents or splinters, etc. So those are the type of things that we know. We also know that having third parties, you were talking about the importance of having an impartial third party monitoring the accord. We know it's important for many reasons. And I use the word impartial because I don't think that the word neutral is really appropriate, right? I mean, I'm a neutral. I represent a US-based private Catholic university. And I'm Colombian. And I'm a woman. You know what I mean? Like, it's not neutral. What you need to be, and this is so beautiful, Chris Mitchell writes a lot about this. He said, perhaps we should all be all partisan instead of impartial. It's not taking part, but having the possibility and the ability to put myself in the position of the different parties. So I am not just, of course, impartial. I'm not taking sides, but I also have the possibility to put myself in your shoes and try to understand how is the process not just being perceived by, but lived from other people's perspectives. And so we know that third parties monitors are important because the conflict parties, after they have been engaged in war for many years, don't trust one another. And they're not going to start trusting one another because they were able to negotiate and sign. So third parties that provide evidence on how is the implementation process going helps the conflict parties, now signatories to the accord, build trust. So we hear a lot about trust building in peace process, in peace negotiations. But guess what? In the implementation process, you have to continue building trust. So it helps with trust building. It also helps with this, what I was mentioning to you, the transparency to civil society. As civil society, we have very little opportunity to have access to the information that a government has, or that an illegal arms organization has because of even the file systems that they have had. To have at least someone that is able to publish a report that is information that everyone can access, it also allows civil society to make the parties accountable. Say, you signed that at the negotiation table. We want this to happen. You said there was going to be a gender approach when you redistribute land titles. Where's your gender approach? Why are women, and this is true in the Colombian case, in Colombia, women are receiving smaller plots of land when they are assigned the title. You're like, what is that? What? They just receive smaller plots. So, no, wait a minute. You said that this was going to be done with gender equality. You said that there was going to be a gender approach transversal to the integral rural reform. So it's a mechanism for us to learn this. These are some of the modalities of civil society inclusion in peace processes. I'm using here Tanya Pfaffenholz. A lot of her work, perhaps you've seen, you've read in other discussions, but we do have a lot of evidence in peace studies that say the more civil society is involved in peace processes, the stronger they are, the more resilient they are, the more durable the peace, the more sustainable the process, and the deeper the changes go in society so that in the face of a new episode of violence, we don't restart the war, right? We have all these different modalities of inclusion of civil society in the Colombian case, plus during the implementation. And we have that, well, in Colombia, but also I wrote it here for Mindanao, for the Philippines, with the Bangsamoro Peace Accord. And of course, this is where I want to start zooming into the Colombian case because I'm aware of time. So hopefully I can speak for 10 more minutes. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we have in the Colombian case is a participation of victims through different modalities, direct consultation, victims delegations to the negotiations, online participation, territorial forums organized by United Nations with the biggest public university in Colombia, and so on. So many different ways. And of course, if you look at the participation, not just of victims, we have a very strong victims movement in Colombia because we have had many peace processes. So since the 1990s, during the 1990s, we had 9 peace negotiations in the country. And many of those peace negotiations said, in order for civil society to participate in the country, you need to be more or less organized. We have various victims organizations. Many of them were or have been women's organizations, which are not the same as victims organizations. We have a lot of ethnic organizations that also respond to much larger processes of social movements in Latin America since the 1970s. So we have a very well-organized civil society that is very vocal and that demands a lot from the negotiation table. And they were able to participate differently. Of course, everyone has a different access. The women's organizations did not have a quite different access than the ethnic organizations. And of course, of victims organizations, but they participated throughout the accord. And one of the most important things, if you're ever at the negotiation table advocating for civil society, is that they were able to have provision in each of the chapters. So we have rural reform, political participation, the end of the conflict, which is basically DDR, the solution to the problem of illicit drugs. As you can imagine, the word solution might have been a bit ambitious. Victims and implementation and verification mechanisms. And so throughout this accord, civil society participated. Yeah. In political participation, one of the most amazing provisions and stipulations that we have in the peace accord is that the victims organize so well that they say, wait a second, why are these guys demobilizing and getting seats in Congress? How about us? How about us? It's the first peace accord that has seats for victims representatives in Congress, not just for the former combatants. Say, but wait a second, we were the ones who suffered the war. So all the attention is going to mostly guys who are the leaders. One of the things that of course, the design is different than the implementation of the victims' seats in Congress, but it's exactly the same thing, is that the political participation. So for this accord to be comprehensive, it can't just be about security and military provisions. It has to really touch the reforms that you guys were talking about, right? And victims, so let me put it this way, everyone experienced a war differently. You experience a war differently by your socioeconomic status, by the color of your skin, by your sexual identities, by the geographies of the territory, by the armed groups that are present in your territory. There are a lot of differential factors. And one of the recognitions of the Colombian first peace accord and then the Truth Commission is that how you are positioned in the world had a direct impact in the way that you experience the war, and that has to be recognized in the peace-building program or project or intervention. And so when it came to Colombia, we were invited to provide the official monitoring of the entire accord. So what we do, or what we used to do until that time in a very academic, research-based way, we changed that and we adapted the methodology. This is when David was the director of the program. And based on the text of the Colombian Accord, we created a matrix where you have all the commitments of the accord. So you take the text of the accord and say, this commitment, this commitment, this commitment, this commitment. For that commitment to become a reality, I need to develop coding rules, right? So if I say there will be a land fund created, so I have to think, what is necessary for a land fund to be created? Do you need a decision from the president or a decision from Congress? Do you need budget appropriations? Do you need a statute? So I write those coding rules, and then with my team, we collect information on the ground. So what David was sharing with you at the beginning, we have lost a third of our staff on the ground. We have right now 23 people, but we are still present in Bogotá, in the capital, and in the territories that were prioritized for Peace Accord implementation. And what we do is we triangulate the information. So we collect information. We not just read the news, no? Imagine if we could have a true, how is it called? Truth Social report. I mean, that doesn't say anything, right? You can get information from the media, you can get information from the government, but we triangulate the information. We create implementation events. This is all in a huge cloud. And then our team on the ground with our researchers in South Bend look at the events every month, and they ask themselves, how is this event or is this event responding to the coding rule? And if it is responding to the coding rule, up to which degree? And then based on that, how does that change the implementation score of 578 dispositions? I want to show you. So this gives us the implementation levels, 0 for it has not started being implemented, 1, it has started being implemented, 2, there is already like an intermediate trajectory, and 3, it has been completed. We have a quantitative base then that allows at least people to know what's the implementation status, but we complement that with a qualitative analysis, and we always, in a very simple way, we always say, this is the implementation status. I'm going to tell you what have been the milestones, so what has gone well since the last period we checked or we produced this report. What have been the bottlenecks? What are the biggest challenges and obstacles? And what are the priorities and opportunities for implementation? So every chapter of the accord, every sub-theme, we have 578 stipulations, 71 sub-themes. For each one of them, you will be able to follow. So what happens? The implementation agencies say, hey, can you help me? Tell me what is your prioritization? What would you do different? Which kind of commitments can create a better process of implementation? And this is, I just took this, I'm sorry it's in Spanish, but I just took it this morning from another thing. So this is what we share with people, not just, we can tell you how implementation is going. We can tell you this has been part of our qualitative analysis. And then what we see is what is the status? What is the status point? We also have special sub-matrix to look at the way that the implementation is being implemented with a gender approach, with an ethnic approach, with a territorial approach. We have special reports that we publish. We have published reports on the environmental effects and impact of implementation. We've published reports on victims' rights. For next year, we're having a special report on political participation, and for the following year on reintegration. So, and we have now 7 regional barometers. So we develop a special sub-matrix trying to understand the submatrix has 32 provisions or 32 stipulations, 32 commitments that either have a very special place in the rural territories or that have a very special impact in the rural territories. So what we see is that as time goes by, the implementation process started very centralized in the capital, big institutional transformations. And as we have moved forward, the implementation is going down to the rural territories. And we're hopefully going to see a better perception or citizen perception of implementation on the ground. But we're still, struggling to make that a reality. And I wanted to show you a little bit of what I consider to be what we're still missing. We're still missing many things. But I think that one of the things that I believe we're very much missing is to really anchor these institutional transformations in relational and personal changes, not even think about the cultural changes that we have ahead. But we've done some good things. The University of Notre Dame, as David was saying at the beginning, the transitional justice chapter is hybrid too. It says we do need historical truth, but we also need to judge the perpetrators. We call them offenders or those most responsible for the grave crimes. And we separate the leaders from the responsible ones because the methodology that we have developed is about collective cases of grave violations of human rights and infractions to international humanitarian law. And the question is, if I take this person out of this criminal pattern, would this crime have happened? Like, were they essential or not? And sometimes you have people, perpetrators, offenders, most responsible one, that are essential even though they were not in the leadership of the organizations, either the army or the guerrillas, yeah? So we are in that process, but before that, we had a very important truth commission. It was a truth commission that was also demanded by the victims at Havana. And this is important, is that ownership of civil society. This is not a truth commission where the president said, he will create a truth commission. No, the victims went to Havana. The victims said, this is what we want from you, negotiators. A lot of the demands from the victims were actually included in the Truth Commission. So we have an entire, very beautiful, very interesting line of conceptual development of victims as peacemakers. And we created a Truth Commission that had a lot of elements. It was based also on a lot of lessons learned. We've had, if you read, perhaps you're acquainted with transitional justice and Priscilla Hayner's book, we have over 236 truth commissions that have been created since the 1970s. There have been different generations of truth commissions. We have generations of truth commissions that were created to deal with the legacies moving from authoritarian regimes and dictatorships to democracies. We have a second generation of truth commissions, like the Colombian one, in which they are included in peace accords in order to deal with the past and the legacies of the war moving into peace time. And we're having now a third generation of truth commissions, like in Norway and in Belgium, where the truth commissions, or we've had in Canada, have been created in order to deal with the colonial past. All these truth commissions have different mandates. And the mandate of the Colombian Truth Commission, I love very much, because it's a mandate that says, contribute to the clarification of the past. So we're going to look at the past. We're going to look at what happened. What is the historical truth of people? How they remember the war. Oh, this is memory. This is not evidence. It's not what happened and what's the evidence, like if we were in court, is how did you experience the war? How did you organize your civil resistance, right? So let's look at the past. Let's recognize the dignity of the victims, right? Everything we do has to start with acknowledgement. so that we can contribute to coexistence, to living together, right? And to the non-repetition of the armed conflict. So you have a commission that has a mandate that looks at the past in order to contribute today to coexistence so that there's no more war in the future. So you have the 3 times in the mandate of the commission. And what the commission said was, we are not only going to do this by looking at the experts' knowledge on the conflict. We've had a lot of commissions of inquiry. We have a lot of academics, practitioners, think tanks that have written about the war. What we want is to listen to the people. They received so many reports, or 1,200 reports. There were 24 houses of truth in Colombia. We worked here in the US, we work with the international chapter of the Truth Commission in 23 countries around the world. The Truth Commission collected almost 30,000 testimonies. So what happened is that, and this happened during COVID, so there was a huge digital archive that they decided to build. They say the legacy of the commission is not going to be the final reports that all these PDFs with 600 pages that nobody really reads. The recommendations are written in a terrible way. That's what happens very often with Truth Commission. They say we want this Truth Commission to preserve that knowledge, and this is where Notre Dame came at a point where they didn't really know what to do with it, and they asked us if we would make a copy of the digital files, put that copy into our servers, preserve the public domain name of the Truth Commission, and keep that human rights archive in perpetuity, available to the public without any restriction. Sounds pretty crazy, and we did that.